2.0 versus the 1.0 connectors you have on the 2013 version of the iMac. And on Thunderbolt 2, you can basically get up to 20 gigabits per second, twice as fast as we can get from last generation. So if you have devices that support Thunderbolt 2.0 connections, that's pretty much the fastest way to transfer data back and forth from an external source. Now, one last thing about the externals, they both have stereo speakers as well as dual microphones and the same front-facing FaceTime camera, and the quality of all three of those things are identical. Now, let's stop kidding ourselves. The only reason why somebody would pick this iMac versus the previous gen would definitely be for its new display, and it has a brand new Retina display that has a native resolution of 5120 by 2880 versus the standard 27-inch iMac that has a native resolution of 2560 by 1440. Now, both have LED backlight, so they're both very vibrant in terms of saturation levels, and they can both get very bright. The black levels are obviously not the best. They're definitely not bad, and certainly an improvement from the previous generation LED backlight displays on these iMacs. They're pretty much equal in terms of the backlight bleeding aspect of it. The other thing too is they both have IPS technology on their displays, so you can view them at any angle with minimal color distortion and shift. Furthermore, you are going to get issues with glare on both of the screens because they both have a glass screen. So if you sit right next to a window, that might be distracting, although it definitely adds some vibrancy to the display, which sometimes you lose with a matte screen. Now, the big difference in terms of the resolution is certainly not apparent when you're looking at the video itself. It is certainly apparent when you are viewing them in real life. Now, 2560 by 1440 is an excellent display. It gives you lots of desktop real estate with a good amount of clarity. I've never had to complain about that resolution at all on the iMac. However, when you move on to the 5K iMac, it is certainly another world in terms of sharpness and clarity. In terms of desktop real estate, what you get with a resolution of 5120 by 2880 is really a lot of versatility. Not only can you adjust it and fine-tune it to kind of balance the pixel density with the maximum amount of desktop real estate that's ideal towards you, you can really get exactly the kind of desktop experience you've always dreamed of. Now, if you go to the 1:1 pixel ratio setting, you're going to go blind, or else you'll need some kind of magnifying glass to use the display, because that certainly is not usable. That's a little too fine detail for most mere mortals out there. But if you balance the DPI setting right, you can get an excellent experience. So if you're doing a lot of video editing and stuff on Final Cut X, you can get the full 1080p video on the preview and have everything you need in terms of effects, in terms of seeing the timeline and seeing the source footage and everything like that, and really customize every workspace to your heart's content. Same thing with Photoshop and Lightroom. You can exactly configure your dream desktop experience. So this is really ideal for anybody that does a lot of productivity applications where you need to see a lot of information in one single monitor. This is certainly the best solution out there right now. And for anybody out there that does any media editing whatsoever, whether it be videos, photos, audios, etc., this is really the dream display for all those people out there. Now, the storage configuration differences between these two computers is quite different, because basically both of them are the standard baseline configurations of the 27-inch iMac. The 2013 version of the iMac comes standard with a 1 terabyte 7200 RPM SATA drive, and the standard 5K iMac comes with a Fusion drive, which is a blend between a 128 gigabyte SSD and a 1 terabyte standard hard drive. Now, obviously, you can upgrade to a Fusion hard drive on the 2.5K iMac, but it's kind of nice that the 5K has that standard. Now, in terms of the speed differences between the two, you're going to find a huge difference. And just to show you guys the difference between the Fusion drive and the standard 1 terabyte hard drive, we're looking at the Blackmagic speed test, which is certainly giving a huge difference in terms of the read and write speeds. We're getting over 600 megabytes per second in terms of read on the Fusion drive, and about 300 megabytes per second in terms of write, and the mechanical hard drive is struggling at 130 megabytes both in terms of read and write. Now, next we're just going to do a quick boot up test to see the difference between how both these two computers boot up from a cold start. And as you just saw over there, the Fusion drive on the 5K just booted the whole OS in 18 seconds versus 26 seconds on the 2.5K using the mechanical hard drive. Now, internally, both the 5K and the 2.5K iMac have a pretty similar heart that's powering them. They're both using 4th generation Intel Core i5 processors. Now, the stock configuration of the 5K is clocked a little bit higher than the stock configuration of the 2.5. Basically, it starts at 3.5 gigahertz and it boosts up to 3.9 gigahertz with the turbo mode, and the stock version of the 2.5K starts at 3.2 gigahertz and boosts up to 3.6 gigahertz, and they both have 6 megabytes of level 3 cache. In terms of RAM, they're pretty much identical because they're both stock, so 8 gigabytes of DDR3 clocked in about 1600 megahertz. Now, just to see if there's any differences between the minor changes in the internals, we're going to go ahead and run Geekbench and see what we get on both computers. And as you can see from the results, our late 2013 iMac got a single core score of about 3300 and a multi-core score of about 10,516 versus our new iMac that has 3540 on the single core and 11,350 on the multi-core score. Additionally, if we look at the Cinebench R15 and test out the CPU performance, we're also going to find a minor difference between them. Obviously, there's not a big architecture difference. They're still using 22 nanometer process, but because of that higher clock speed, you do find a higher score on the 5K, getting about 532 points versus 438 points. Now, moving forward, we're going to talk about the graphics capabilities of both of these two computers. Now, thankfully, we do have a little bit of a difference over here. On the new 5K iMac, we have an upgraded AMD R9 M290X with 2 gigabytes of GDDR5 versus the NVIDIA GeForce GT 755M that had about 1 gigabyte of GDDR5. Now, that extra amount of video RAM is definitely going to help with rendering video and generally handling that 5K resolution, because the more video RAM you have, the better it is at higher resolution. Now, to test out the GPU differences between these two computers, we're going to do a couple of these benchmarks. Obviously, we're going to do some gaming benchmarks, so we're going to use a synthetic benchmark that I like to use, which is Unigen's Valley benchmark, which we're going to set at 1080p and make sure our render quality is at medium settings so we get some pretty decent frame rates on both GPUs. And taking a look at the results, you can see we got a solid 44.7 frames per second on the 5K iMac and 35.76 frames per second on the 2013 version of the iMac using that GT755M. Now, both of these are certainly not the highest performing gaming GPUs. They're really designed for workstation stuff. They work extremely well with Final Cut X. If you're doing any kind of rendering, both of these are going to be really fast. But after getting my hands a little bit wet into some video editing on Final Cut 10, I do have to say that the R9 M290X is an insane graphics card, especially if you're going to use this as an editing machine and exclusively use Final Cut 10. Now, if you use a lot of the Adobe Creative Suites such as After Effects, Premiere Pro, Photoshop, Lightroom, it's also pretty good at that. A lot of things are GPU enabled, especially with Photoshop and Lightroom and Premiere Pro as well. But it's certainly not as optimized as what Apple has engineered this graphics card to do to work with the OpenCL platform in Final Cut X. So if you're into video editing, you definitely want to stick with Final Cut X on this iMac. You're going to get the fastest results possible. Now, this isn't the fastest gaming PC as you saw from the benchmarks, but it's certainly passable for most games that you're going to play on the Mac. Obviously, if you do a dual boot system with Windows 8 or something like that, you can play all the PC games that you would ever want, and it certainly can handle most games at 1080p at fairly decent frame rates. But if you're a hardcore gamer, you're probably not going to get this machine. Even though it has a nice 5K display, you're probably going to be better off of building your own custom PC and buying a 4K monitor separately. Now, one last thing about the display I like to add is that the 5K iMac is certainly quite a bit more than the 2.5K iMac, and that price is certainly justified when you start looking at buying a 5K standalone monitor that has the certification of what the iMac has, IPS and LED backlit. So in that circumstance, it certainly is worth the price tag that it's going for at around $2,500 USD, because to buy a 5K standalone monitor with the same specifications is at least going to be that, if not more. And in fact, most of the major manufacturers out there, Dell, Samsung, LG, Asus, don't even make 5K monitors available to consumers. The max you can do is 4K. So really, in terms of rarity and overall exclusiveness that you get from a 5K display, it's certainly quite a unique product that's not not really available anywhere else. And eventually when Apple brings out and updates their current line of cinema displays, they're probably going to charge somewhere around $1,500 to $2,000 for it. That's what I'm hypothesizing right now. Obviously, we'll have to see when that actual display comes out, but even at that price, a $1,500 or $2,000, it still justifies getting this iMac versus one of those 5K cinema displays and a Mac Pro. Because honestly, if you take a look at the top spec iMac, it really rivals the performance on what you would get in a mid-range Mac Pro. And if you add one of those mid-range Mac Pro to a 5K cinema display, you're certainly going to